Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Unsprawling Podcast, a show examining Calgary's urban form, urban fabric, and the ways Calgarians interact with it and improve it. I'm your host, Hazen Ellwood, or Biz. I'm an aspirational professional dork and co-founder of Unsprawling, and I'm joined today by our friend Willem Klumpenhouwer to talk about recent developments in Calgary's next major LRT project, the Green Line. Willem is a transit data and research consultant, aka an actual professional dork, with a PhD in transportation engineering from the University of Calgary. He likes to explore the intersection of transit and land use policy as co-founder of housing advocacy group More Neighbors Calgary. Willem, thanks for joining us for this exciting episode of the Unsprawling Podcast.
Very exciting. Thank you for having me, Biz. The PhD stands for professional dork. I don't know where the H goes, but
yeah, the H, the
the H is silent. We'll just
professional,
say that.
professional with a PH, actually.
Yeah.
So let's just get right into the headline. As you guys probably saw a couple of days ago now, if you're watching this on when it releases, July 30th, Council voted to update the Phase 1 scoped budget for the Green Line, which will now go from Eau Claire to Lynnwood-Milliken at a cost of $6.2 billion, which is a major shakeup from the Phase 1 plan originally communicated in 2021, which was Eau Claire to Shepherd for $5.5 billion. So Phase 1 is now 6 stations down from the planned 12, which is 5 fewer stations between Ogden and Shepherd, and actually 1 station removed downtown on Center Street. But the silver lining is the smaller phase enables the city to be able to take responsibility for those for the cost increase from one budget to the other. So this phase is now fully funded and will hopefully proceed with no insipid politicking between other orders of government at this time. It was approved 10-5, with Councillors Chabot, Sharp, Chu, Wyness, and McLean voting against. But I think it's really important to remember that they all, I think Chabot was like a little like, do we really need to do the whole project? But the vast majority of councillors were in full support of being able to eventually get to that full north, full south plan, just with some disagreements on how to get it done. Willem, walk me through your immediate reaction and thoughts when this news was coming in as a transit consultant, as somebody who's been really, really engaged on this project for a while, actually.
Yeah, I've been talking about and advocating for the Green Line for a long time, and definitely since it should have been built already. But I do remember many years ago even talking about alignments and pushing for better things. And it's unfortunate to see some of that sort of getting pushed to the back burner for the priority of getting a project built at all, which is understandable. Yep. So I think to me, it's not surprising to see that the project is more expensive than it was to begin with. Every transit project in North America is becoming more expensive, and really around the world for various reasons. And we can talk about that at some point. But I think they were sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, which was either find more money, and that didn't seem to be happening, or change the size of what they were doing. And so I think this is the result, and it's probably the best that you could do with the circumstances.
Yeah. I think one thing, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, one thing that I like remembering is that this is now shrunken down to about the size that most other of our LRT projects, like the Red Line and the Blue Line, all started at about this size and then expanded later. And so, it's interesting that we kind of started with this gigantic proposal with some napkin math a decade ago. Said it would be complete by now. I think it originally was supposed to be finished construction in 2024.
So I think napkin math is a bit generous. Even I think there were sort of 2 schools of thought, which was, what do you want to eventually see, and then how much money do we have? Are we giving you? And somehow I feel like in the haste of all of the announcements and the projects, which of course famously was from the federal government, put forward by Jason Kenney of all people. That project sort of got, I think those two concepts got mushed together, and so you had a budget envelope and a vision that I don't think ever matched in the first place. And I think you're right that these lines have to start with small steps. I don't think the cost of the original red and blue line chunks when they started were quite this, even adjusting for the time. But yeah, they do have to start somewhere. And I think there's not really an option at this point to just say, well, we're going to do something else, because I don't actually think any other options like BRT or other things you could do are any better.
Yeah, I think, and some people I saw on Alex's podcast he did about the topic a couple of days ago, somebody was frustrated or just confused, like, why did they bring it over the river just to stop it almost immediately at that terminus station in Linwood Milliken? But it does really look like they're trying to get all the expensive parts of this project out of the way so that it is a lot more predictable to get this project continuing to move, continuing to develop at a good tempo as we go.
You don't, like, I don't know, as I'm always fond of saying, like, you don't build a skyscraper or a tall building, with the top two floors first, right? Like, you need a foundation, and the foundation and laying those things, and, in our case, building the parking, I guess, is all the most expensive part, right? The digging and the foundational stuff is quite expensive. So I think that the same thing applies here. You have to start with the complicated parts, unfortunately. So that's good. And they basically were like, how far can we get with the money we have, with the express and very clear intention that the idea is to extend it almost as quickly as possible. And I think I heard a quote from somebody, it might have been Councillor Karov, saying that, we never stop building it. We're always sort of adding to it as we go.
Yeah, Councillor Karav's been all over the news on this, and of course he might be one of the one of the loudest warriors of the Green Line since it started back in 2015. And yeah, one thing that he had said is that it might not even like this phase might even change by the time we're ready to go with it, if we end up seeing prices fall or more funding come in sooner than we expect. Another thing that Kara had said that I found really interesting is back when, and even though the budget was less than napkin math back in 2015, at the time he said there were essentially no rail projects happening in North America to this scale whatsoever, and now there's over a dozen. And so he said, if you think about the competition on the construction market for this kind of labor, we're now in a seller's market where a lot of these contractors that we're asking to do this highly specialized work are putting us further and further down the priority list because of some of the political uncertainty around here. How important do you think that is factoring into the cost overruns on this project?
Yeah, I think there's a larger conversation to be had, I think, about the costs of a lot of these large transit infrastructure projects in North America in general. There's a really great group, which is worth looking at, called the Transit Costs Project, from their research group in New York. And they went and their basic question is like, why do comparable projects in Europe seem to cost less and in Asia seem to cost less? And they take a bunch of different case studies and put together sort of a laundry list of potential reasons. And I think, the big takeaway is it's not one obvious thing. Like, it's not just the provincial government delaying things. It's not just inflation. It's not just the procurement process, but it is all of those things, I think. So I think Councillor Carra is right. There's a different market right now that makes it easier for people who build these kinds of things to look elsewhere, or say we'll do it for a higher price. And I think it's easier for I think there is political risk. There's the Green Line extension. Ironically, it's called the Green Line extension in Boston. Also sort of seemed to be flagged that political interference and political risk and delays and uncertainty was a part of that as well. And then I think we have I really think that I hope out of this we have a larger conversation about how we procure and fund these kinds of projects in the first place, because I think there's some interesting conversation to be had about how to um, how to manage, especially a lot of the professional services costs that come with these that can get quite big.
Yeah, and it definitely feels like a similar situation in housing conversations right now, which we can touch on a bit. Is even just the rising interest rates over the last few years. They're obviously not everything, but it really has inflated the carrying costs of the project. Once you have kind of got going, but in a weird, slow, limbo-y state, that can the higher interest rates can really drag out the debt that you have to take on to finance the project. And that's why I think we were so excited about zoning reform, and obviously there's so much room to go. Just in that, a lot of these really, really big projects can accrue debt like crazy if you're not working on them quickly and on a schedule that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
You wrote an article back in March for the Herald called "Do you want to de-risk the Green Line? Build it now." Kind of talking about this political uncertainty making contractors actually factor the risk of the project being canceled into their estimates, which drives up the cost. Do you think that as we get this project moving credibly and we show people we're serious about doing this, do you suspect that we'll watch construction costs actually come down at all?
I don't know about that. I think, the one thing I want to mention that one of the mayor's debate during the conversation on Tuesday, she went through sort of a laundry list of things that are more expensive that have to do with construction, right? Like it sort of never ends. And you've described just now sort of how there's this perfect firestorm of things happening. And so I just don't see inflation doesn't tend to run backwards. It may stop increasing as quickly. That would, I think, be the best we can hope for. So I don't know that, without changing anything else, that the costs are going to come down necessarily. I think the way the city's changing they're changing the way they're doing things, which is that the city's going to take on more of the manager role of, from what I understand, more of the sort of prime contractor style role rather than having a company do that. And that might give more options for cost savings here and there. And it might also, but it also comes with some risk, right? The risk has to go somewhere. I don't think that the risk isn't anywhere. So I think, back to the article I wrote, that's a little bit tongue in cheek to sort of, provide a bit of a counter approach to a lot of the narrative that we've been hearing about rethinking the Green Line or redoing it. I don't think we're at the point where the problem is the plan, like the planning aspect of it, the transit project. The problem is other things. It's the implementation and it's the politics. So I think the idea is we need to get started on it, and it's trite, but it's true that I don't think it's going to be any less expensive than it is now. Because we can't go back in time.
Yeah.
So I hope that it keeps things stable and it provides some potential opportunities. But I think without drastically changing the way that we do things, unless say the province or the federal government takes on more of the risk outside of the city, that we're gonna change that a whole lot.
Yeah. I think the replanning and relitigating every little aspect of this project, even it has failed to bring the project cost down so much as how much it brings up. And I think it's such an important thing to remember. It's so much better to just do something and then, adapt it, change it as the situation evolves. Cause this big planning debacle and trying to bring costs down, I find has really just, and you can see it really clearly when you look at the phase shrinkage that we've had to deal with is it's really just created not a cheaper product, but just a worse product. I always say this when we talk about housing too, is we can't just let people build houses without like a roof and call it affordable housing. Like we need to deliver the same level of good for a more affordable price.
Yeah, for sure. I think some of the disappointing aspects, that from this that maybe are the most disappointing to me is like removing that Center Street Beltline station. Um,
Yep.
I think there's a few of those things. The length is what it is, but I think there's a few of those that I hope we don't completely lose
Yep.
track. With that said, I do think that I think a good LRT system does not have to have fancy stations, and it does not have to. It can be pretty
Absolutely.
bare bones on a lot of those things. So
Yeah.
maybe there's more opportunity to
I
do that as we
remember
go to.
I was looking at one of the old renders for the Eau Claire station, and somebody was like, "This looks like somebody's masterpiece." Like, do we think that Japan really cares this much about their train stations? Like, they just get them done. It's nice
Yeah,
to
it's
it's
quite
really nice
grand.
to
Yeah.
have really great public spaces, but that is, I think, one of the places where you can cut down costs because a place being really awesome to experience and be in is usually um, the things that people have added to it over the years more than it is just having a great design straight up. Uh, but yeah, you talked about the Center Street station, and of course the 5 stations were moved from the southern leg of the original phase one. Um, I believe in the Green Lines report they did give some estimates on how much those things would cost. I think filling those out was just another one billion or maybe $1.5 billion. And the main reason they de-scoped it still is because the city can pay for 6.2, but they can't pay for 7.2, 7.7. And so the silver lining is that, like you said, the city can really consolidate their power on this project and not have to rely so much on coordination between different levels of government. But I'm curious, because I assume you were or at least watching alongside the conversations at council. Were there any indications on how they're looking to cover for that $700 million?
They did. So there was a long sort of a large set of recommendations that came through, and there was a little bit of fancy math. And you can actually, if you watch the council discussion, you can see them praising the accountants for working incredibly hard to figure out how to not magically, but kind of magically find cost savings here. Of course, money's going to come from somewhere, and so there might be a little bit of do this later or do this first kind of thing. But the change in part comes from the city shifting. So the cuts get them kind of back to this 700 million over. Then they changed the procurement model, and that saved them a bunch of money. And by taking, I think, more risk on ultimately, if you have to call it a trade-off. And then there's a little bit more that they found through various different pieces uh, to fund it. So I don't really know the details a whole lot because it was a lot of wizardry. I feel like I'm pretty sure actually wizard was used several times by several councillors. So that's interesting.
Is that an official role at the city of Calgary?
I think
Money
so.
wizard?
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, the money wizard. It's either super sinister or super like. It's great. We don't
I
ask
can give you free money,
questions.
but I can take it away at the same time. So
Yeah,
don't.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that's good
So
job security.
yeah.
Um,
So the hope is, more of it comes. I think there's also possibility now to access new funding, federal funding
yep.
to extend things. There's a bit of a different definition from building an original project versus extending an old one. And while it seems like semantics, it can make a difference. So different terms of reference for things. So that's also definitely a possibility.
And there is that new federal funding program for like a more permanent transit funding to
Yeah.
municipalities. I remember Councillor Chabot was a little confused because I think he said maybe that only applies to like intercity projects or things like that. But I think it was just like part of the prerequisites to receiving that funding is that you, as a transit agency, kind of have to agree to play nicely with other transit agencies in your region. Um, am I understanding
Yeah,
that
I
correctly?
don't know the terms of reference too much. I don't think it's just applies to intercity things. I think
Yeah.
it's just A lot of the money for the Green Line comes from I think it's called Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program or Plan, ISIP. And that just precludes you from sort of changing the project in the middle of it. And so I think this permanent transit fund will include things like an extension of the Green Line or even extension of the Red Line or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit of wishful thinking, a little bit of politicking that they won't have to increase property taxes at all. We should remember that we still have, I think, the lowest property tax of any major city in this country. And so going from the lowest to still the lowest or second lowest is probably not that big of a deal, as long as we can get a transit line that functions a little bit quicker. I want to talk a little bit about this procurement strategy that they changed up, because I that's one thing that I have like no idea how to really understand the ramifications of. To me, it seems like if you have lots of different contractors working on the project, it would be more of a coordination problem. But at the same time, would that be able to deliver the project faster if you have kind of different parts of it that are going at the same time?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure which of the models they have lots of, the engineering has lots of different, design build or design bid build. In fact, that's part of the conversation of the transit cost project is looking at different ones, and the type of model doesn't necessarily change whether something ends up being expensive or not, although it can. So I think the intention is to, instead of what typically happens is you have a big consortium that is in charge of the whole sort of project. We say, you kind of come to a group and you say, we want the Green Line and we want it to go here, but beyond that, we want the Green Line. And then they sort of take it away and do a bunch of work. And then, so there's a bunch of planning work, tons of planning work, which has been going on. And then they kind of use that to help decide on the implementation and the construction, and then they actually do the construction. And so that's one big lump sum, and they will manage a lot of subcontractors. So they'll go out and part of their, I guess, initial bid or their pricing of the thing will be to say, okay, well, we think we can get this person to do this for this much, and or this company to do this for this much. And now the idea is, well, you shift that prime contractor or that sort of overseeing body towards the city, and the city sort of becomes the contractor. So I'm going to try and make an analogy here, and it might fall apart, and I might do it. But like, let's say analogies never really work with your own home. But let's say you're renovating your house, or you're doing something along those lines. You could hire somebody as the general contractor who is in charge of everything, but you have to pay them to do that, right? For one thing, and you have to trust that they're giving you sort of the best value for what they are. If there's a ton of general contractors and the work is pretty interchangeable, you can be pretty, reasonably assured that the contractor you have is giving you a good deal, or at least, following the market. If there's only like two contractors and you're trying to, I don't know, put a pneumatic tube messaging system in your house or something really weird and complicated that nobody does, and there's only like two people in the world that can do that, now all of a sudden you don't have that sort of market force competition. And if there's lots of other people that have decided to do pneumatic tubes now, so I'm obviously letting things run away with it, but the idea being, it can be difficult to get somebody to oversee that. And so if you take that on yourself, of course, there's additional risk of like, you may not exactly have the same expertise as this person or this general contractor, or if things go wrong, you're responsible for it. You don't have insurance, but they might come with insurance, that kind of thing. So I think that's the part of the shift in this procurement, and there are potential advantages in that. The nice thing about being directly able to negotiate with people with the city, so somebody might be able to come and say, look, actually, we think we can do this for a lot cheaper because you don't necessarily need this type of material here or there. This is something that pops up in the transit costs thing as well. So sort of shifting the design part to a certain extent and then getting to the implementation and not having that be one big project is, I think, what they're hoping to save the money on. And it'll be interesting how it goes. I hope it goes extremely well.
And I guess, getting a little bit closer to the operations side maybe helps them save costs in the long term as well. If it goes well, then they'll have a lot of those connections and skills to be able to go in and do the expansions a little bit cheaper.
Yeah, that would be really nice if there was some internal expertise. I think that's a good way to we've gone away from that sort of model
Yeah,
in
and
the
I
90s
assume
and
that's one
early
of the bigger
2000s.
reasons why North American versus European rail is um, so different in cost, is because uh, when there's just not that expertise here, you have to import it from a different country. Um, it just adds lots of confusion to the project. Um, I want to touch on kind of the difference of cost between this core segment and the expansions that are coming later, because I think it's important to remember that half the scope for $6.2 billion doesn't mean the full scope for 12.4. I had already kind of
Yeah.
uh, talked about earlier that it's actually only about another billion or a billion and a half to complete what would have been the full phase one scope, which is actually pretty good. Like, I think just off the top of my head, that's only like a 20 or 25% increase from what it was before, which is decent when you look at what other cities are facing and just what inflation is in general. Um, yeah, what are some of the
Yeah.
factors that go into the difference in price there? Because I think the cost per kilometer was like 13 times less.
Yeah. I mean, the cost per kilometer, I've never been a fan of that metric because I think it's very misleading, right? And I think that kind of has to go with a lot of metrics. I think right now, if you take cost per kilometer and you take this project as is, it's one of, if not the most expensive LRT projects ever built, like on the planet.
Yeah,
And but if we had gotten more funding and we had extended it longer, then per kilometer it wouldn't be the most expensive LRT project. So it's kind of a little misleading to say that. Like if we built 1 kilometer of tunnel under downtown and did one station or two stations, then it would be extremely expensive per kilometer, right?
yeah,
So I think the metric is a little misleading and unfortunate, like frustrating, because I think this is obviously the most expensive part, and that comes from tunneling, I think almost entirely, and building underground stations. Those are way more expensive. Whereas as you head to the southeast, there's a little bit more room to build and maneuver. There's all
yeah,
much more surface running things. We're using some old rail corridors, and the nice thing about old rail corridors is that they've already been designed to have rail, so they're already the right grade, they're already the right steepness, and curves are fine. You don't have to do nearly as much work to make those.
One particular thing, even though Ogden is just barely out of scope, like it's just the next community south of Linwood Milliken, there's already been, I think, like 300 or $400 million invested in that station, and so a lot of the money that has already been invested into the Green Line has gone directly into making those expansions as simple as possible moving forward. One thing Kara had said was, if we don't build the core, we'll probably never build the core. To in his debate against councillors who are suggesting instead we could do like a suburb to suburb line. Maybe we could bring some of the further southeast back into this and just stop it around Linwood Milliken instead. What do you talk to me a little bit about the cost of the core? Um, I know there's some debate over would it be better to go at grade there. Like it's like a whole kind of can of worms that I feel like there's so much bad information out there.
Yeah, and the funny thing about the Green Line is that it has been planned and thought about and reevaluated and adjusted and debated and electioneered all so many times that like everything anybody suggests has been thought about and discussed. So like why can't we be surface in the downtown? And the answer was inevitably that we want to have long trains, like longer than say Portland, which is just two cars. Um, and to have those long trains, you would end up having to stop across a block, right? The blocks are shorter north to south because you're going north to south. So you'd block a whole street, um, or you'd have to close a street to a station, and that just wasn't something that the city was willing to do for various reasons. And we also know from our existing LRT system that running on the surface with lights and things like that is significantly slower. Like the downtown takes almost as long to get through as other sections of the whole line. If you want to talk about, the average speed. So that's not super great. And then the other question is, well, why don't you elevate it? And I think I've been warming up more and more to elevated lines. I think elevated lines can be really nice, and they can work really well. The Vancouver has some good ones. The problem is that we have these plus 15 systems which sit perfectly kind of right at the right spot and would definitely be in the way and would require either some taking them out or some adjustment there. And again, there was strong pushback from the people who own the skyscrapers next to it about having this set up that way. So ultimately, the answer then becomes, well, we have to go underground. And I don't think it's unreasonable to go underground. There are, Toronto has plenty of places. Let's even just take the Beltline, set aside the core, the belt, like plenty of places far less dense and densely populated than the Beltline that have subways. And so having an underground rail there is not unheard of.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's difficult to deal with the traffic. Like you're talking about the red line and blue line, which obviously conflict with each other a bit. And they've even planned around having all the lights in the downtown area based on trying to get the trains to move through that area as quickly as possible. And that's the slowest area for them. I think that's one of the next big priorities for Calgary's transit, is being able to get the red line underground as well through that location. Yeah, I mean, it would be really cool to close the street off and destroy some plus 15s. That would be pretty radical, but I don't know if we're politically there yet in this city.
Yeah, and there's a trade-off. I think there would be operational problems. I think there would be I think there would be a lot of other problems. And don't forget, there's a lot of transit that runs east-west on the surface. A lot of buses go that way too. And so you'd have to figure out, what you're doing with them as well. So
absolutely.
I think it's not an unreasonable thing to be tunneling under the downtown.
So as of yet, we don't have any details on how the Green Line team will approach phasing the future of this project. I think that's the work on that is expected about this time next year, as one of the recommendations that council put forward a couple of days ago. But as somebody with experience in the transit planning world, what do you think are plausible moves that they want to make, and about how much those things are going to cost? Just like
in terms of extending it?
Yeah.
Well, we know a few things. So we know that bringing it down to Shepherd and filling in the Beltline station is about $1 billion to $1 billion and a bit right now. So let's say $1.5 billion when we get around to that. And I can imagine there will be similar types of numbers to get across the river and go north. I can imagine Center Street is going to fall somewhere between the sort of more expensive parts of the southeast and the least expensive parts. I think you're on the surface of Center Street, which is good, but there's lots of interactions with traffic. There's signals, things that need to be done. There's construction problems. Another big thing that I think is worth keeping in mind is, a lot of places that have cheaper transit construction, like in Turkey, for example, in Istanbul, they just build 24/7. They never stop. They don't work at night, or they don't stop at night, anything like that. Whereas in some cases, they're trying to build a transit line while running a highway or while running the road at the same time. Like, I can't imagine they just close all of Center Street for 6 years or whatever. So all of that, I think, is going to contribute to the conversation, unless we're willing as a city to decide that the savings are worth it, right? So that would be an interesting conversation. I also think some of the motions that came from Evan Spencer from Ward 12 kind of suggested that Shepherd is still the first step, right? Like, I think that was the sort of initial promise, and I think that's still the first step. There's some possibilities that if money comes quickly for that kind of extension, then you could take the maintenance facility that was supposed to be there and put it back there before you even need to build the one that they're planning to do in Highfield. So there are some potential sort of things that can happen as it goes. Like, I think there's lots of of different moving parts going on. So those are the obvious next steps I think for the Green Line. And I think, again, seeing that stage 1 from 16th Ave to Shepherd is still the first priority. Like, I don't think anything's fundamentally changed on, again, all of the years of planning that they've spent figuring out what's the best place to start. 100%. Right?
Yeah, even the phasing is probably extremely similar. I think the city has, if I remember correctly, put down about 100 million into the BRT for the North Leg. And so I think it's been pretty much all other than like officially worked on and put out as a project, as a max line. And it's one thing that Calgary, obviously we're not the first city to come up with this, but our max system is quite innovative in that we've designed a lot of them to have lots of separated infrastructure so that they can be retrofitted and turned into LRT lines a little bit later down the line. And I think that's definitely going to come into play a lot in the Green Line conversation is, can we service some of these suburban communities really quickly by building some of these shovel-ready LRTs? Have you heard anything about the plans for the Southeast in that regard?
I don't. I haven't heard anything specifically about that. I don't know that that's a plan. There's a little bit of a debate to be had about how, especially with Ottawa's example of being very, very focused on BRT and then converting it to LRT. The biggest question being, what do you do with the BRT buses while you're building the LRT is a very big question. And how much of a savings you get from that. I think, it's worth, keeping in mind that originally when the first Blue Line and Red Line, when the Red Line came up, they ran feeder buses and express buses to the stations when they ended also. So there's going to be things like that, and there's going to be some adjustments of the transit system. I think the North, regardless of what happens with the Green Line, the North is so long overdue for at least moving buses and passengers faster. The Green Line is one way to do that because it kind of unnecessarily gets a little bit more right of way and has a little bit more capacity. But that needs to happen, I think, regardless. I think the Center Street corridor is just so full, and buses are getting slowed down by cars so much that needs to be adapted, kind of no matter what happens. And then it would be just a nice sort of happy coincidence if those two things lined up really nicely.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think even the transit up there is already pretty close to capacity. It's such a busy corridor. There's that bar chart from back in the day showing the crossings over Center Street Bridge, and it's like the number of vehicles versus number of people, and then once you go to number of people, the transit part of that bar just explodes. Like it really moves a crazy amount of traffic every single day. So absolutely, really, really hope that we do get some BRTs that are built kind of in parallel to be able to service those suburban communities that need to get downtown, get to the Green Line. And I think that is one of the things that frustrates me about how people are speaking about the Green Line and how we've shrunken the scope and feeling this very overwhelming kind of cynical disappointment. Although, like, I get why people would be disappointed. It is very disappointing that we didn't get this on the road sooner. But I am excited that some feeder bus systems will functionally connect together that corridor, even if it won't be as quick and as serious. Do you think, just looking at, we keep talking about, this is essentially how the Red Line went, essentially how the Blue Line went, is starting with a small core section and then really quickly trying to get some expansions out as funding was enabled. Do you think that the situation we're in with the Green Line was kind of inevitable, or we should have just started with this in 2015? Or do you think we could have actually gotten somewhere really quickly if we were able to advocate more effectively there?
No, I think the plan that we had in 2015 or even before that was good and was ready to go, and we should have just done it then. And I think theoretically we could have had that line all the way to Ogden, or all the way to now I'm already adjusting in my head, all the way to Shepherd to begin with, and from 16th Avenue all the way to Shepherd potentially, right away. And I think, I think this is the cost of having waited more than anything. And there's some of that waiting is totally understandable. COVID kind of makes it hard to undertake some of these things. And some of those delays are frustrating because they seem meaningless, but elected politicians decided to do them, and I think that elected politicians decide to do things for various reasons. But I do think, if that's, you could make certain arguments about people forging ahead on other plans that may not be palatable to other people. So I in a way kind of understand just these delays happening, and I wish it wasn't there, but I think it's still an important thing to get started. And I spent a lot of the last week, the week before the vote, kind of with a sense of what we might be looking at, and really sort of being upset and angry. And I can understand the cynicism, and I can understand the frustration, and especially like if you live in a place where the train was supposed to be built to and now it's not. Like, I can fully understand the frustration. But I think ultimately I was sort of like, well, you can't just do it. You can't just say no and not do it, because the realities of the situation aren't that, well, we can just take this $5 billion and do something else really good with it. We can just build more houses. It'd be really nice if we could do that.
People live in that house has got to move somewhere.
Yeah, and I think if you sort of gave, me a $5 billion, not that you should do that, but if you gave me a $5 billion budget and say make transit better, I don't know, the Green Line would be the thing I came up with. But the Green Line is what is getting that money and attracting that money, and so it's sort of this pragmatism versus what you wish you could do, right?
Yeah.
There's so much money around that could be used in various ways. So I do think it ultimately is like, this has to happen and start, and you do have to start with something.
That's actually one major difference between the red line, blue line, and the green line is that one I guess upside of having this full North Point to Seaton plan from the beginning has really given us a couple decades now of building communities around that, around the stations, instead of as we did with like the red line, you getting off at University Station right in the middle of Crowchild, or like I live in Mayland Heights and we have two ridiculously, grotesquely isolated train stations here that nobody can use because they're just so like in the middle of nowhere. And so that's one thing I think people get wrong about the Green Line, is that it's moving through primarily industrial districts, especially with this core area. But one thing that I think that unlocks is just such a property value uplift in the area, such like a potential to put housing there. And so if you want to talk a little bit about what are some moves that you really want to see the city make in terms of with the Calgary plan, they really want to integrate land use planning and transit planning together. What are some things that we should be looking for near those stations in that area to really maximize the efficiency of the current scope we have?
Yeah, integrating transit and land use is kind of the holy grail of planning. I feel like they are symbiotic. They're one and the same kind of thing. I would really love, just to sort of kind of address or talk about that idea of, while this going through an industrial area, people do work there. There are businesses there. It's not just because you live near a transit line, if it doesn't go where you need to go, then it's not a useful transit line either, right? So I think it's worth keeping in mind that it's not just about where residents live, although that's obviously key. It's about other destinations that are important as well, and connecting those kinds of destinations, Crossroads Market, things like that, that people might actually want to visit. I think that there's plenty of opportunity. I think, frankly, I feel like we need to get our sort of transit-related housing figured out on the lines we have first, because they're there and
It's true.
they're certain, and we know they run well. And I think that would give us lots of lessons that we could potentially use for future things like Green Line. I think there's some conversations to be had about, there's been this conversation about Midtown Station on the Red Line, where there's going to be a very large, hopefully a very large housing development, bunch of different types of housing. And then with that, it's big enough that the developer seems to be willing to at least to basically build a train station and fill in an infill train station. And I think we need to have conversations with, these developers and intensification along the Green Line too. Like, hey, that's a great way to do that.
And I think that's, sorry to interrupt,
no,
but we were talking with some planners a few weeks ago at a Calgary Plan chit chat event, and that was one thing. One of the planners who had worked on Route Ahead kind of thought was interesting is having more private development in this scene, because that's one of the frustrations people have with this de-scoping of the Green Line, is that it misses, Mackenzie Town, Seaton are kind of the two big examples of these communities that were really built for transit, that are now facing really bad traffic problems because the transit hasn't come to them. And I'm wondering if we can even look at that model with Midtown and try to leverage some of that partnership to say, and that's essentially how our old streetcar system was built as well. It was private development saying, we're going to go build this community and link it to transit. And so hopefully, as we have more an easier time getting transit going up to sort of 21st century standard, we can start to see those communities really feel start to see a more sustainable form of suburban development if we are going to continue doing that.
Yeah, I think as long as we were aware of the potential sort of perversions of those things, so as long as we're aware of the potential for, say, a developer to start arguing for an alignment change or an extension, or say it should go all the way south first, where my company builds out all the infills, that those kinds of conversations can potentially. So if you have a line that's been planned with certain goals, and some of them are equitable, things like that, and then you have a developer come along that says, hey, we want to help integrate with this if there's an incentive for us, then that I think is maybe a good place to start. But it's always good to think about how things can be a little bit perverted. So
yeah, and transit oriented development is obviously not the end all be all of housing. I think Nathan Horlock,
it's not the only thing we should be doing.
I think Nathan Horlock had said about Midtown is with the 10,000 or something proposed housing units and the time frame, we would need to build about 300 of those, and we literally do not have that many transit stops in this city.
Not yet. No.
Not yet. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Just, I guess, in summary, what do you think that advocates should be celebrating about this news? And what do you think should be kind of our next steps as activists, as advocates, to really look into the Green Line issue? And what are some demands that we should start making and organizing around?
Yeah, I think the first thing to recognize is, I think it's okay to be a little upset and to, kind of look at a thing and say, well, we have to go through this whole thing again. And people feel like they've gone through this conversation multiple times with this project, where it's just continued to change. And I think it's okay to sort of take that time. I've taken that time to be very annoyed about how that all worked. But then I think it's worth remembering that, even in the face of that, it would be very easy to say, well, forget it. It's just too complicated for a city. It's too expensive. It's too, it's the problem with transit is that if you don't build it, the problem with transit advocacy is if you just don't build transit, it's not like a building falls down or a pipe bursts or things like that, right? Transit never just fails really obviously, almost. And so because of that, it's easy to just say, well, we just won't build something and then we'll be the status quo, and it is what it is. You don't have this obvious decline into things. So you have to focus on the benefits of it. And I think even in the face of all of that, that would be easy to do for council. I think it would be well within their sort of political sort of realm and shield to do that, even though the Green Line is popular, that they're still very strongly committed to doing this. And the vote wasn't really close. on this kind of thing. So there's the city's clearly on board, and they're willing to shift a lot of their money around to try and make it happen. It's not a vanity project. They like, it's not an arena. They like very clearly see that has a huge benefit for the city, and that there's people who may not support it originally, whose ward it doesn't even go through, that are still supportive of it. So I think that's really something to be celebrating, and understanding that politicians are getting that you need transit like this in cities. Like, you just,
Absolutely.
cities are going to continue to fall apart if you don't do that, even if there's not this very obvious direct evidence of it. So I think that's really worth celebrating. And the fact that they've managed to find a way to not just hit this financial black hole where they say, even if we wanted to, we couldn't, right? They found a way.
Yeah.
So I think that's worth celebrating. I think moving on, we need to ask, obviously, for more commitment to extend the line and to sort of keep building it out. Because the more you add to it, the better this expensive chunk is going to be in terms of the number of people on it, right?
100%.
The more you tack on to the end, the better this one, the more value you get out of this expensive chunk.
Yeah.
And so that's obviously a big ask that we need to go for. And I think it's also okay, and we need to be asking a little bit of like, how much of this is actually truly unsolvable? Like, how much of this is actually just like, it's inflation, it's macroeconomic stuff that nobody in any government in Canada could really do much about? And then how much of this is really doable or really changeable by rethinking how we fund transit in Canada? Because I think we really need to just keep pushing on that,
For sure.
on that conversation. So that's a bigger one, but yeah, I think it's worth. I have a positive outlook. Maybe it's naive, but I don't think it is. I think, as you said right at the beginning, this is how a lot of this stuff gets started. It shouldn't be such a huge fight, but it is. So,
and definitely major props to the Green Line team as well. There's a surprising amount of work that's already been done on the project, and I think it's really incredible as well that we are finally moving. It's happening. We don't have to worry about isn't going to happen, and that it hasn't been significantly worse. Like, we're not shaking our heads figuring out how we're going to get $8 billion, $9 billion right now. Like, they've actually kept quite a lot of this under wraps, which I think we should definitely praise whenever we can. Just understand a lot of this hard work that people are doing in our city, all around it, to make it a better place. Even if a lot of that work is very invisible and sometimes easy to be cynical about.
Absolutely, it's easy to armchair criticize. Also,
it's so easy to be a backseater.
What's going on? It's so easy, and I think it's worth asking questions and poking and prodding. I think that's important, but I do think, it's also worth recognizing that there's been so many changing factors, so many changing ideas that have come through, and they're always trying to get the best out of what they can get. Like, I just, nobody at the city is sitting
smart people
how
do
we
this
waste
stuff.
money on this project, right? Like, I can't imagine that's true. People work at the city and work very hard at the city for these kinds of things.
Absolutely.
I know that for sure.
Well, it's a good note to leave it on. Go email your city councilor and say thank you for getting this to actually happen. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you, Willem, for coming on to talk about this and providing some of your expertise and your understanding of the situation.
Absolutely.
And thank you for watching the Unsprawling Podcast. We hope to see you next time. Bye-bye. Have a great rest of your day. And go ride the Green Line if it's a few years in the future.
If you're listening to this 6 to 10 years in the future, you should go ride the Green Line.
Absolutely.